Hey there, and welcome to Emery Tales. This week's story is Thomas Undone. Let us begin. Thomas stood on the roof of his apartment building with a cool breeze at his back. The sun shone, the flowers bloomed, and the world was beautiful, almost in equilibrium. But the stinging smell of gunpowder and the intermingled chorus of battle cries, death knells, and monstrous howls disrupted the harmony. Looking up, Thomas could see fluffy white clouds lazily hanging in the air, unconcerned with the turmoil happening below. Below, looking down, was sheer chaos. Soldiers and a few brave civilians were trying to hold back the swarm of demons that came on like the tide. There would be a mass push, then the demons would thin, but the moment anyone dared to hope it was over, another wave of demons would come screaming out of the nearby trees and from behind buildings. As much as anyone might want to say the soldiers were faring better than their civilian counterparts, it would be a lie. Sure, some of them were better disciplined, and small groups of these people are what held the rest together. But Thomas saw just as many soldiers panic and run as he had civilians. From what he could see from his vantage point, the demon army seemed to be composed of mostly massive, furless, dog-like creatures with suspiciously crocodilian jaws, though much bulkier. Thomas was a witch to the other locals. They just didn't know it. Witch was the quaint local term for mages in his hometown. Until the war began last year, he didn't really see a reason to give his new power any thought. It was pretty useless after all. What good was making an undead squirrel going to do in his daily life as a forklift operator? As he stood there watching the human side slowly being worn down, Thomas cursed himself for his apathy. Try as he might, he didn't feel anything for the strangers dying on the ground beneath him. He numbly watched as people were butchered, turning his apartment parking lot into a charnel house. He wondered to himself if the demons were simply toying with the defenders. They were able to send wave after wave to slowly erode the human line. Why didn't they just send everything all at once and overwhelm their foe quickly? A gurgling death scream was followed by a series of frightened cries. That must be the answer. They were terrorizing the humans for some reason. A malicious sneer played across the young brunette man's face as Thomas raised his hands before him. Pulsing purple light with sparks of silver gradually spread away from him. When the light reached the first corpse, it shuddered, but remained still. As the waves of light crawled across the battlefield, corpses began to rise, one by one. Not all of them, only those who would heed Thomas's call to fight again. Those who possessed arms and heads turned their guns on the demons. Those less fortunate charged, even blinded, at the demons around them. This was good, but it wouldn't be enough. Thomas gritted his teeth and closed his eyes, focusing as much power as he knew how to into his magic. The soldiers looked on in shock and despair as their fallen comrades took the field again. Several tried to stop their friends, thinking they were still somehow alive. But the dead would not heed them and hurled themselves at the enemy. Each soldier regained their senses in their own time, but eventually most of the living rejoined the battle, fighting beside or behind their brothers and sisters. The next twist came when some of the demons' corpses also began to respond to the waves of power washing over them. Though far fewer than the humans that answered to the mage's will, many of the demons rose and began tearing into their former allies. The noise of the battle, nor the heat of the blood dripping from his nose brought Thomas out of his trance-like state. It wasn't until the vessels in his eyes began to burst that he awoke. He stumbled back half a step and reached up to his face, feeling the warm blood that had leaked from him. He stood staring at his hand a moment before the sound of fighting finally brought him out of his little world. Thomas wiped his hands on his pants and wiped the blood from his face with his sleeve before stepping to the edge of the building to check on the fighting below. Looking down, he saw the demons had turned their attention from the massed human forces to focus on the apartment where he stood. "Fuck! No, no, no! Stay away from me!" He turned and looked back at the stairwell that led to the roof. His eyes darted back and forth, looking for any way to block the stairs, but there was nothing. Thomas wasn't sure what he was expecting. It was a roof, and he turned back to the fighting below. Fuck! The demons were breaking into the building and beginning to gather around its base. Looking out further, he noticed a group of undead enmeshed with their living brethren and shouted, Hey! You want to keep them alive? Then help me! If I die, so do you! He wasn't sure if it was true, but it seemed a safe assumption to him. The undead, both human and demon, turned en masse and set upon the building sieging demons. Thomas didn't understand how, but the battle had escalated. No longer would a person simply die if their arm was torn off. Instead, the undead would continue their attack with undampened vigor. Something about the scene made him feel mighty and terrified at the same time. No sooner had one of the demon dogs made it to the roof than it was set upon by a group of mixed living and undead soldiers. The group closed on Thomas. The dead faces were expressionless, and the living looked angry and afraid. Thomas took in the faces before him for a moment when he noticed only one of them was alive. A young black man with a square jaw and latte brown eyes. The necromancer looked at the younger man. His name tag read, Okamo. Hey, soldier dude, Okamo. Are you alive? You don't look, he pointed towards the small band's leader, like them. Okamo looked at his squad sergeant and then at the civilian. What do you mean, like them? Thomas hesitated and looked down at the young soldier's weapon for a second. They're dead, or undead, or something like that. They were dead, and I asked for help, so here they are. He racked his mind. He had seen Riley and Jessup go down, but Sergeant Stanton didn't have a scratch on him. What the fuck are you talking about? Shouldn't you be evacuated already? He barked at the stranger. I was sleeping when the evac alarms went off, Thomas offered with a shrug. But who cares about that? We need to get out of here. He started to walk past Okamo and the corpses when the young soldier took hold of his arm. You need to explain now, Okamo said. Thomas tried to jerk his arm away from the soldier, but found the task beyond his strength. Let go of me! He struggled, to no success. Those things are going to kill us. He looked to the dead behind him. Get him off me! To Okamo's surprise, Riley, Jessup, and Tavish all raised their weapons and trained them on him. It was Sergeant Stanton that had turned their barrels aside. He then stepped around the civilian and grabbed Okamo's wrist. Okamo stood shocked, not only by the strength of his NCO's grip, but at the stern expression on his face. Slowly, he released the civilian, who promptly pulled back a few steps behind Tavish and the others. Stay here and talk to the demons for all I care. I'm leaving, the young man spat childishly. Fuck you! The angry soldier screamed after the civilian, then turned his attention to Sergeant Stanton, still holding his wrist. What the fuck, Sergeant? Who is that guy? The corpse seemed to struggle to speak. He gave us a choice. There was a pause, then a slow breath in. We chose. Fight. Protect. Another pause. He commanded. Defend. The dead man fell silent as a half-formed expression of sadness struggled to the surface. Sergeant Stanton turned and brought Okamo along with him as he followed Thomas, relaxing his grip and then releasing the young soldier. As the two reached the bottom stairs, they saw Thomas standing behind a collection of the undead with his head down, seemingly in prayer. In front of that was a pile of dead and dying demons being torn asunder from both sides as the demons threw everything at trying to get to the mage while he called out to steadily more dead to attack the offending demons. It took all Okamo's will not to vomit at witnessing the sheer gore of the scene, much less the rancid odor of decimated bowels mixing with the metallic human blood, and the fetid scent of the demon's blood that was so pungent you couldn't so much smell it as it stopped you from breathing at all. As Okamo stood transfixed by the nightmare before him, a group of undead demons tore through a wall to Thomas's left. Sergeant Stanton grabbed Okamo and dragged him along as he followed Thomas and a group of defenders through the newly made escape hole. Private Okamo was exposed to increasing scenes of violence as they drew nearer to the outside of the building. Sergeant Stanton, for his part, was quick to fire on anything that managed to get past the hallway of flesh provided for them. Eventually, they reached the outside, and when the fresh air hit Okamo, his stomach had enough, and evacuated the contents of Okamo's last meal, SpaghettiOs. Stanton refused to let the young soldier fall behind and practically dragged the sickened man behind him. Out here, the fight seemed less intense. On this side, it seemed Thomas's forces had the upper hand. "You! Take that guy somewhere safe," the civilian commanded, pointing at Okamo's squad sergeant. The young man watched as the corpse hauled the retching young soldier up on his shoulders and took off at a sprint. "I can't really help anyone else, but at least that guy can get out of here." He sighed, then walked to a demon dog and mounted it like a horse. "All right, time to get out of here. The rest of you, hold the demons here." With his final order given, Thomas turned his mount and urged it to carry him away from the battle. Later that day, Evelyn Okamo would receive her son, delivered to her by a dead man. Okamo would never remember the exchange between his mother and his now dead sergeant. What he wouldn't forget was the relief and fury raging across his mother's face. Evelyn would lead her newly minted unit, the 1st Armored Division's Paranormal Squad 6, Aegis Wall, back to the ongoing battle and join the few remaining survivors. This would also be recorded as the first time an A-class demon would be successfully repelled. Thomas would spend the rest of his day putting as much distance between himself and the demons as possible. It wasn't until nightfall that the reality of everything that had transpired that day would hit Thomas, and it crushed him. His chest felt hollow. He couldn't assemble a single thought, and tears streamed down his face. The man struggled to contain himself and buried his face in his arms as he sat against the low wall of the cemetery. Coherent thoughts were lost to him, but the scraps were torturing his soul. What had he done? What had he become? Those were human lives, and he left them. Images of the brutality inflicted on those who fought plagued him even when he opened his eyes. A hand clutched around his heart as the man's mind wailed. Thomas cried until his eyes ran dry in the dark. Slowly, he lay down on the pavement, curled into a ball. Eventually, sleep took the exhausted, vulnerable man. His dreams were haunted that night. He could see them dying. He hated himself for feeling nothing at the time. He wanted to destroy himself for being such a monster. The scenes played out, violence and screaming. Only now, he could feel the emotion of those screams. They weren't simply people beneath him. Only the faces of the dead soldiers that saved him on the roof looked at him. The rest didn't even acknowledge his existence. In his dream, Thomas screamed, cried, and begged each one for forgiveness as they died. He tried to stop them, to command them, but it was like he wasn't even there. He was worthless. Thomas was nothing. When he woke, the sun had yet to rise. His demon hound sat before him, and Thomas considered commanding it to end him. He sat and stared into the multi-fanged maw of the beast. Thomas lowered his head and fresh tears began their travels. "Do it," he whispered. The demon whispered back, "No, your will cannot command me. You are broken. You gave me another chance to kill, so I will give you another chance to live. Thomas looked up in horror at the beast. You can talk? Had he forced sentient beings to kill their own kind? The weight was almost tangible as it fell on him. No, the demon cooed. You are broken. Thomas tried to be angry. Angry at the demon for taunting him. Angry at himself for losing control. Angry at himself for being weak. But he couldn't. His despair was crushing him. Thomas crumbled to the ground again and wept. He didn't have the fortitude to do anything else. Some hours later, Thomas woke up again. He hadn't remembered falling asleep. It was raining. The world around him felt as melancholic as himself. The air was cool. The smell of worms filled his nose. He sat up and rubbed his face. The rain hadn't just started, so what woke him? Holding onto the low wall, Thomas hauled himself to his feet, then half leaned and half sat on the cemetery wall. He turned his gaze to the unliving demon before him. "Any idea why I'm awake?" he asked. The demon turned its head to look down the road. "Scream," it said airily. "Thought you couldn't talk." Thomas looked at the demon and shook his head. "Oh, yeah, you said I'm losing it." If there was a scream, he didn't hear it now. The only thing he heard was the rain that fell on and around him. He looked over his shoulder into the cemetery. If there is something over there, I'm going to need more hands. Thomas stood listening to the rain. It made him feel less alone for some reason. But his brief peace would be shattered by the wail of what had to be several people. Thomas's eyes went wide. "Dig!" he shouted and pointed at the closest headstone. He hopped the short stone barrier and concentrated on releasing his power across the graveyard. The demonic beast tore at the graves with unnatural vigor. Within a minute, the first skeleton arose from its slumber and climbed from its coffin. Minutes rolled by with barely a sound from down the road. Thomas wanted to go and see what was happening, but he didn't think he had enough forces yet. He looked impatiently between the demon and the road. "Damn it! This is taking too long." Thomas turned and yelled to his hound. "Dig up any more that answered the call. The rest of you, come with me." Thomas and his small, 8-person skeleton crew walked down the road toward where he had last heard the screaming come from. He looked down every road as he passed for blocks. There was only rain pattering on pavement, grass, or rooftops. He began to wonder if this was just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, his talking, dead demons said he was broken. He stopped in the street and listened as best he could. Eventually, he gave up. Standing there in the rain, he muttered, "You're not a hero, Thomas. You won't save anybody." His heart felt heavy in his chest again, and he turned to head back to the graveyard. What am I supposed to do? As he walked back to the gathering undead of the cemetery, a girl, no older than 10, came racing out from one of the roads. She was crying and didn't even see the skeletons, nor the man as she ran into him. Thomas stumbled a step and caught the girl. At first, she fought to break free, but he wrapped his arms around her and said gently, "Hey, it's all right. It's all right. I got you. What happened?" It took a moment of reassurance to calm the girl enough for him to understand. Her family came back, but they were attacked. He couldn't make out anything else she said. A strange new flame ignited somewhere within Thomas. He was no hero, and he couldn't save her family, but what he could do was grant her revenge. The arisen dead reacted without a word from him and gathered around Thomas. "Protect her." The hound moved to tower over the human girl as the man and his now 30-member crew of skeletons head down the road where the girl had come from. Thomas scoured the street, Nearby buildings, he swept the entire block until he found them. They were gone, stabbed to death among other horrors inflicted on the mother and oldest daughter. Thomas bit down on his hate. This wasn't even the work of demons. They were killed by people. His knuckles went white as he strained to contain his frustration. Thomas didn't even understand how he should react, what he should think. The rain was cool, but his blood was boiling. If the man had any tears left, they would have fallen here. You three, he pointed to a few skeletons to his left. Wait here. Take the bodies and bury them in the graveyard soon. He let out his breath. Just let me get the girl away from here first. With that said, he turned and headed back to the girl. When he got back, the girl was huddled down crying. Thomas rushed over. Hey, it's okay now. I'll keep you safe. He tried to calm her. The young girl looked up into the adult's gray eyes with her own green eyes and said, trembling, But you're one of the bad guys. You have demons and skeletons. What? Thomas looked around him at the various undead. No, it's not like that. The girl cut him off. Then let me go. She screamed and smacked away the hand Thomas had placed on her shoulder. Thomas was shocked and stood staring blankly as he watched the little red-headed girl run off into the rain. That day, Thomas made a promise to himself. He would be better. He would do better. Maybe he could never be a hero, but he could place himself between the people and the demons. Maybe he would die tomorrow. Maybe he would live to see this nightmare's end. Black buckled dress shoes, a little red dress with white trim, the rain falling all around him. Thomas would never forget this day. Well, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this content, consider leaving a like and a comment. If you'd like some more, hit that subscribe button. If you'd like to help the channel grow, consider sharing this video or becoming a Patreon. Link in the description.